So we're going to have an opportunity, and we'll do the best that we can to incorporate some of the questions that have been coming up in the participant Q&A box. Some of those we've addressed already, and we've been looking at them. We'll do our very best, try to incorporate them into the discussion that's going to follow. But I think a good place to start that off would indeed be asking Gabor for his reflections, and then we'll begin to unpack some of those other questions as well.
Thank you, Al. Actually, when Roshi invited me in the end of the last session, my question and my comment was kind of introducing this session. I was not only approaching John with the question, but also Hannah and Ezekiel and Evan, Richie, as well as Adam. How do you see this bigger question around ethics if the enactive approach is as universal as it seems to be, and if it is as descriptive as it seems to be? And that was one of John's questions as well. What to do with ethics in the context of these crises that we were talking about in the last 2 days?
Thank you, Gabor.
It's such a dense theme that has run throughout all of the presentations. So let's indeed hear from some of the other faculty. Adam, I see a comment that popped up there. Can you unpack?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, you know, I mean, the lovely virtue of being a physicist is like you never have to deal with ethics, right? Electrons don't particularly have ethical implications. But I do think, you know, from my work on thinking about biospheres and the evolution of, you know, civilization, social system civilizations in general, as a kind of general kind of question. I think the most important thing that a new direction in science, the thing that Evan and I and Marcelo are thinking about, is how much this, you know, this system, the scientific worldview, which again is not really about science, it's about this metaphysics of the blind spot, kills everything. It just it does not understand how to value life as experience, you know, the experiential foundation of life. So what it values is abstraction. It values quantity. That's where the reification of the mathematics comes from, particularly in the political economies that we've developed. You know, when I was writing one of the sections of the book on the Earth, I went back and I started looking at the literature about the entangling of capitalism and science, which is really kind of a new field. People trying to understand how capitalist methods of production, which then again, it goes right into socialism. It's not like there's really any fundamental difference in terms of, because they were all extractive, they were all colonial. And that valuing of the abstract of that, you know, a mountain and a forest is really only as real as the numerical resources, you know, the numerical value of the resources that can be abstracted and then turned into commodities that can be sold on markets and the markets have these incredible, you know, sophisticated mathematical models going along with them, that it's just absolutely blind to the mountain as a mountain. You know, thinking of Dogen as mountains and rivers. Yeah, I know, Roshi, that you would. Yeah, that beautiful one of the
snow makes a mountain.
Snow makes a mountain. Right. And so it's really hard for me to speak of because it's not my field. And I don't know, and I feel so completely overwhelmed to speak about like to the school shootings. You know, I mean, I don't know. But when I think about when I think about my own domains, is that the scientific enterprise has to be cast in another light. That is, you know, for those of us who work in science, that is the beginning, is to recognize that this underpinning of the modern world, you know, that has to be, we need a completely different way of viewing it. That's going to be a real fight. But from that, if we can reintegrate our epistemology to understand that experience and life is what's fundamental and important, then this monetization of everything, because really what it comes down to is power and money and greed. Like that's really kind of what it comes down to. People in power don't want to give up power. People with money don't want to give up their wealth and privilege. That you really need a very, very different system for that. And if I could just close on one thing that I've been reading, The Dawn of Everything, which is this anti-big history book. And one of the most amazing things about that book is the way it retells the entire history of humanity. The story we've all heard about this progress from hunter-gatherers that were kind of egalitarian, but not very sophisticated, into villages, and then villages became cities, which needed empires, et cetera, et cetera. And it just retells that story and says, there's an entirely different way to tell that story, where we had cities that didn't have hierarchies. We had large collections of human beings that may not have had, aristocracies. And so it's this idea that we can learn to retell our stories in a way that gets us out of this narrowing that has happened, right? We talked about this during these last 2 days. We don't have many conceptual choices left to us right now. And that's crap. We've been sold a bill of goods there. And science has been part of being sold that bill of goods. And so I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Adam. So I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to John Dunn kindly posted the link to the book that Adam just mentioned, so you can copy it from the chat box. I'd like to, since we began yesterday with Ezekiel and Hannah, really introducing us to this important observation of the enactive view as really embedded in morality. Is there more that either one of you would like to say in response to what's just being presented?
Yeah, I'd like to say a few things actually, but
Please.
I'll select a couple. First of all, thank you, John. That was a wonderful presentation, and I learned quite a bit from it. And I really liked what you've done with my slides. I thought it was inspiring. And you raised several questions, and I think I will at least try to answer a couple of them from my perspective. One was whether Enaction was merely a descriptive endeavor, or was also, this is related to what the last couple of questions too, or whether it also has ethical implications. First of all, what I like to say is that in offering an alternative description of human minds, we're already, as you describe, you're already performing an ethical act, or an act with values, because we are saying perhaps a particular way of looking at ourselves is creating certain damage. Seeing ourselves as separate from the world, seeing ourselves as individuals, seeing ourselves as self-concerned, which has a few important things around us and nothing else, or seeing ourselves as very abstract thinkers with our brains and so on. That already is a sort of a source of problems. And I think, at least I can speak for myself, that much of the work in Enaction that I find interesting is driven by showing that things are not exactly like that story of the old computational mind, but there is another story. And that act in itself, I consider, has some ethical or values and implications, because that other story is, one hopes, also aiming at a different direction in how we view ourselves and how we view our relations to the world. But having said that, it is true, as Gabor said, that if it is, well, I wouldn't say a true account, but it is a good account of human activity, it should also account for non-ethical acts. Gabor mentioned wars and so on and so forth. Well, indeed, that's, I think in my talk I was trying to suggest that a good theory should also account for all those other things that we perhaps don't find so savory, such as why these divisions and distinctions are so persistent. So it's not in that sense a theory that says this is an ethical implication of the theory as such in explicit terms. We have written a paper with Hanne called Enactive Ethics, and part of the message of this paper is Enaction is not a theory of ethics. However, when you follow some of the things that are developed in this approach, well, certain things pop up, you know, like the idea of participation, the idea of difference as generative, and so on and so forth. And this also leads me to answering one of your other questions, which is are we able to revise the enactive approach? Are we able to go back and cover what's wrong with it? And indeed, I think that's important, like Evan said, and I think it's partly what we're doing. So for instance, 10 years ago, I think we would be focusing on this individual, as you said, this organism, and the work we've done with Hanne about participatory sense making was already there, but it was more like, okay, let's bring these two organisms together and start seeing how they interact and so on and so forth. Today, from that initial move, we have in linguistic bodies a rather different approach, which is we are looking at the individual from as an achievement of a community. It grows out of a community, and therefore there is nothing, especially in human beings, there is nothing that we can ascribe to ourselves as individuals that hasn't grown in the community, from language to the patterns of how we perceive a visual scenery to the style of our movements and so on. Our individuality comes through in how we are, you know, using those patterns and how we change them, and maybe we are not, if you like, erased as individuals, but so that's an example. I would see it as an example of the movement that the enactive approach has, is of you know, not necessarily undoing the previous work, but kind of reinterpreting it or redeploying it in a different way. And that's why I like that the idea of the dialectics that keeps always going and it never stops. You know, tomorrow there may be something else that we are revising about what we see today. So that's an answer to your question. And just a final quick thing. I found a lot of fascinating resonances with some of the things you were saying, and some of the things I tried to say in one of my last slides about laying down no path, and how that could not be a retreat from the world, but it had to be somehow finding a way in which you can make the path-making materials fertile for other paths, for others. I wonder, but this is just a quick impression I get. I mean, maybe you see some differences there, but I think I find that encouraging too. So yeah, that's my comment.
Thank you so much.
Can
Hannah,
I say one
please,
quick thing?
Please respond, John.
I
Sure.
want to say, Ezekiel, yeah, I definitely think that resonance of laying down a path which enables other paths is very much aligns. And been trying to find linguistic bodies on my bookshelf. I know it's there somewhere, but I still haven't read it. I'm a little intimidated by it, but I'll get there sometime.
Yeah.
So, but I could see, you know, part of what I would say is what I see in an enactive perspective is that it can, on the one hand, describe, just like Dharmakirti's system would purport to describe why people engage in violence, but that it self-consciously scaffolds one to a place where that would no longer make sense. And I have a feeling that there is a way in which that's true of an active perspective as well.
Thank you, John. So, Hannah, anything that you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I do. Thanks. Yeah, I think to say a bit more about how Enaction moves forward, changing itself in line with what Ezekiel said, that in the linguistic bodies work, we talk about or conceptualize and engage with individuals as made in community, the research we're doing is also more and more with community, for instance, and communities that science used to be about, like, for instance, autistic people were objectively looked at through psychological science and really mischaracterized, misdefined, and mistreated. And now increasingly we are listening to autistic people, really listening and working together to conceptualize, for instance, autism better, or try to, and making advancements in that way too. And I also would like to say something in relation to Gabor's comments and in relation to John's talk, with both of which I really loved. But I want to say something about loving and knowing epistemology, and for instance, something like the school shootings and war or racism, and considering that a weird participatory sense making. So I understand the impulse to think of school shootings as a weird participatory sense making, but there's a danger in that we other it so much that we cannot actually engage with it in a way that might lead us to being able to change it. I think a loving and knowing epistemology actually takes it seriously that other people have other logics on which they act, and really try to understand what it is that for them makes sense in order to really step in, engage with it, and try to change it. If you other it too much and it's totally weird to you, I think the possibility to change it remains cut off because you make a division by doing that. And maybe I can explain it with a kind of metaphor. I think when we do participatory sense making, we can think that we do that in a kind of container where we meet, and the container is fine, we understand each other. But this word of groundlessness fascinates me. I don't know what it means actually in the Buddhist framework, but to me, when I think about groundlessness, it means falling through the bottom of the basket or the container because you don't understand what another person is doing. You fall through the bottom of the container that holds you in participatory sense making, and you lose the ground, and you fall down onto another ground where you really don't know what the other person is thinking. But maybe being on a kind of groundlessness and emptiness and not knowing opens you up to a really other logic according to which another person acts. And that makes a different possibility for understanding what they are doing. I don't know if that's helpful or means anything, but I think an enactive epistemology requires that we are able to crack ourselves open to difference as well. So we are transformed also by knowing something that we don't understand. And I think that's something that we didn't understand in the beginning when we made participatory sense-making theory, but that's becoming clearer now. And I think it's important to deal with crises of not understanding each other.
Thank you so much, Hannah. From loving and knowing to groundlessness, there's a question in the chat that makes contact with this, and it's from Deb Roman. She writes, I once remember John talking about concepts and mentioning that compassion too is a concept, but perhaps a useful concept. Could you talk more about this? So, John, anything you'd like to reply, and then we can hear from others as well.
Well, I'll just say very briefly that anytime we're talking about something, we're using concepts. And, on the Dharmakirti account, they are always, again, incomplete and distorting. So what that would mean in the case of compassion is something that we identify as compassion, that the particularities of that concrete experience are always going to escape the conceptualization of that experience, or always be, in some sense, lost by the conceptualization. But then there's also a way in which compassion, not as a descriptor of an experience, as a way of categorizing experience, but also, a kind of experience, but also as a kind of trope. I think it can then play a different kind of role, like in a realm of discourse. And it's very powerful And, it's a very powerful way of turning our usual sense of the world on its head. I mean, the role of compassion is to radically reverse our usual way of being, to flip our perspective, and to suddenly be in ways that what Hannah was just saying, I think, very powerful. It's like to really be able to see through another's eyes, even another who seems so weird and wrong even. And so as a kind of paradigm, then also compassion, I think, at that more really in a way abstract realm is clearly an ethical guidepost for Mahayana Buddhism. And that is what, again, reshapes the world. Wisdom is kind of what undoes it, sees through the constructions, but then compassion is what it reshapes it, rebuilds, remakes.
I appreciate very much something that Francisco wrote about compassion. He said it should not be surprising that one of the main characteristics of spontaneous compassion, which is not a characteristic of volitional action based on habitual patterns, is that it follows no rules. And I think this is such a cogent way of describing what compassion really is. It's inactive, it's responsive, it's emergent, it is adaptive, it is about sense making. So I think that perspective that Francisco is articulating, that it doesn't follow rules, it's not prescriptive, it's not predictive. And I think this is one of the things that, these words of Francisco really prompted in me another view of compassion where I saw it not as a feeling per se, but really as a process emerging out of a suite of conditions that is non-predictable.
Thank you so much, Roshi. And this makes contact with another question that was raised within the Q&A box from Ashley Price-Sabate about non-volitional arising of compassion within this context of inaction. I'd like to consider another of the problematic areas, as it were, and this is a question from Rika Preiser, who, and probably addressing this initially to Abiba. She writes in their book, The Techno-Human Condition, Brandon Allenby and Daniel Sarowitz suggest that our ways are locked into technology in ways that we cannot distinguish anymore, from the glasses we wear to the coffee machines we use or the hardware we extract from African soil to run our phones, computers, etc. Technology can be seen and used, it's written here, in bad ways. But the larger reality is that our dependence on technology is shaping us in ways we cannot disconnect from unless we disconnect from the world. The problem might not just be technology, but the capacities we have as humans to engage in deeply human ways. We need more capacities in making good decisions and deep notions of justice before we change technologies. So Abiba, first of all, to you, something you'd like to perhaps respond to that?
I'm not sure she's here, Al.
I wonder if I could.
Yeah, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, because this is actually something I've thought about with the idea of the technosphere, biospheres, and technospheres. That, the biosphere is this incredibly complex adaptive system that has evolved over, billions of years. And it is autopoietic in a certain way, or at least it is, self-maintaining and self-producing. And what's interesting about what's been happening over the last 100 years or so is the emergence of a technosphere, sort of the sum total of all of the technology, of which we, the human beings, now are kind of embedded in. We are not separate from it. And it has its own logic. And there was a paper we just recently did where we tried to argue that, the biosphere had to go through from a a state of being immature, where it really didn't have the autopoietic functionality, to becoming mature, and that took some time in terms of building up feedback mechanisms, to the technosphere right now is clearly immature in that it's actually destroying, it's creating the conditions where it will no longer persist, right, via climate change, etc. But the important point here is how much we are sort of embedded in and cannot live without these technological systems. Or I don't know where my food comes from, right? It just shows up at the grocery store. And the important thing is that like the biosphere, the technosphere is composed of not infinite, but many, many, many feedback loops that regulate its behavior. And what made the biosphere sustainable over long times and in a way that allowed life to persist was that it developed feedback mechanisms that would keep perturbations from making it difficult for the system to persist. We don't have that in the technosphere. So for example, the example I like to use, is I can go to a bank and I can say, hey, I'd like to take out a big loan to build a housing development, and the bank will say, oh yeah, that's fine, no problem. But if I go to a bank and I say, oh, I'd like to take out a loan for a coal burning plant, they're not going to say, like, no, that's terrible, you can't do that, right? Whereas if I did go to a bank and say I'd like a loan for a nuclear weapon, they'd be like, well, the system just won't allow that. You can't get loans for nuclear weapons. Likewise, when we think about school shootings, right, the technosphere for some people, the systems of bureaucracy are such that you can, somebody who clearly shouldn't have a gun can walk in and buy a gun, and there's no feedback loop that keeps that from happening. And so in many ways, I think, when it comes to technology, what the things that Biba was talking about, machine learning, these algorithms we're implementing that are controlling the technosphere, is that there's virtually no feedback loops. There's no feedback loops that are keeping the system that is not maintaining the humanity, perhaps the inactive perspective in that. It's allowed to run rampant for reasons of power, money, and or power and money. And that's really one layer that has to happen now, is that we have to build those feedback loops into the technosphere. And that's the legislative part or whatever. We've got to kind of be out in the street forcing our governments to try and that's what people are trying to do, to build those feedback loops that keep the system from becoming insane.
Yeah, I think that's what Jenny Lacoste just put into the chat. She says, we human beings are the feedback loops.
Right. But the technosphere, we human beings, the thing is that about the technosphere is it exists, it's more than us, right? That's just like the biosphere is more than an individual tree, it's the forest that is the living organism, not the individual trees. So the technosphere is larger than us. And so, we've got to build it into the technosphere. It's not just our individual actions. We've got to build these regulatory systems into this larger system that we are both constructing, laying down the path, while also living in, on the path.
Well, thank you, Elon Musk. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I knew I'd get that reaction from
Elon Musk. Let's get him here next time. Talk to him.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think he's going to come.
Next lifetime.
Great idea.
I'd like to.
I wonder if
go
there
ahead,
are
Roshi.
questions our presenters want to also ask of each other.
Yeah.
I wanted to just jump in on this particular issue of technology and first say that I completely agree with the comments that Adam just made about what is, quote, needed. And also, I just want to acknowledge the wonderful talk that Abiba gave, bringing attention to some of the challenges that we're facing. And there are folks who are working on this in ways that I think are constructive, like Tristan Harris and his organization. I think it's really going to be a big challenge, and I certainly am not sanguine about change in that arena occurring and these feedback loops being implemented anytime soon. I think one thing that is worth pointing out, and we've sort of alluded to this, is we've all been, we're all participants in this grand experiment for which none of us have provided our informed consent. But there is something that we can do, I believe, and that is that when we reflect on attention, technology has become masters at capturing our attention. And we know that there are two major forms of attention. One we call stimulus captured, which is what's happening through technology. The other is volitional and self-directed. And we know that that can be strengthened. A recent study shows that the average American opens her or his phone 262 times a day. That's simply unnecessary. I think we'd all agree. And we can learn to change our relationship to these devices. We can strengthen our ability to resist the urges which may occur when we have a device. And data even show that the mere presence of a phone that's in the visible vicinity of a meeting without notifications on, but simply a silent phone, is sufficient to capture attention and to lead to compromised presence in this kind of interaction. I think that, you know, one of the things His Holiness harks back on is the importance of education. I think we can strengthen these qualities in our children in ways which are very accessible. We know how to do this. And I think we have a moral obligation to bring this into the schools. You know, and this brings up one other point, which I can't help but go back to, and that is that all of the issues that we're talking about and the beautiful presentation that John, you gave, and the discussion of groundlessness and emptiness, we know that the only way that's the only way to recognize that is through the addition of procedural learning along with all of the yada, 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 yada that we've been doing. And I think that it's going to require that kind of practice in order for us to produce the change we wish to produce.
Thank you, Richie.
You know, I'm noticing a few postings in both the Q&A box and the chat box that are coming from either our Spanish-speaking or French-speaking participants. Amy, I noticed that you had responded to one of them. So I'd like to pause and ask, are you seeing things that are making particular contact with some of what we've been discussing and you'd like to bring into our discussion?
I responded, thank you. I responded to one, someone who was interested in learning more about Enaction. And so I suggested that this person look at our Mind and Life Europe YouTube, where there's a tremendous amount of really interesting material about Enaction. But I'll take advantage of the floor to follow up a little bit on what Richie was saying about education. And even though it doesn't necessarily fall under the rubric of procedural learning, one of the things that I feel quite strongly about is the fact that the enactive view, the enactive approach has a whole scientific lineage that many of you know a whole lot more about than I do, but that includes systems thinking, that includes people.
Bateson's work.
Bateson, of course, but even before that, people like Uxküll and all the way through up to people like Evelyn Fox Keller, Susan Ayama, a lot of our friends from the more recent years, yeah. And in fact, yes, a lot of people that Evan Thompson's dad, Bill Thompson, brought together.
And Hazel Henderson.
Hazel Henderson, etc. Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock, etc. So my question, one of the things that I always think when I think about when I look at primary school biology books and high school biology books, I'm not talking about us, I'm not talking about even necessarily university students, but why they are learning year after year and still are learning a version of science that's very much oriented towards this command or control system, and they're not learning this particular lineage of scientific thinking that was so powerful throughout the 20th century and the 21st, but also even before. So it's something that I've been thinking a lot about for Mind and Life Europe. We're working a little bit on that question, but any ideas that you have about starting earlier, learning this type of conceptuality would be interesting for me to hear about.
Response from any of our other faculty?
Just one thing, I feel real quick. Were you going to say something, Evan?
I was, but go ahead.
I just say really quickly, I think, part of this is simply what I'm not sure how to put it exactly, but basically, if we think, for example, the distinction between collectivist and individualistic cultures, that there are kinds of explanations that, those cultures are going to prefer. And I think to the extent that your American culture tends to be more individualistic, that's part of what's driving, I think, the style of education.
Yeah, I think it was Adam who made an interesting comment that reminded me of a book by our friend John Stewart, who died a couple of years ago, unfortunately, called Breathing Life into Biology. And what he talked about was the way of teaching biology that drains through understanding evolution and understanding individual development through mechanisms like genetic systems, that and not thinking in a more, I dare not say the word holistic way, but perhaps we could just use it here as a place marker, drains life out of biology. And that seems to be something that that the enactive view or the enactive approach wants to breathe back into thinking about biology. So I think it's probably linked to the individualistic, at least partly linked anyway, to the individualistic account. But it may also be linked to what Adam was talking to about the economic account.
Evan, you had something
Yeah.
you were going to respond?
Yeah, I was just going to add onto what Amy was saying that I think science education is especially important in this context. And Amy mentioned Lynn Margulis, and one of the things Lynn did, I mean, Lynn was an amazing person, and one of the things she did, one of the world's foremost microbiologists, she would go into elementary schools and she would go into high schools, and she would speak to students both about her passion as a biologist and how she, as a woman in in the 1940s and 50s, managed to establish herself personally as a biologist. But also she did a lot of work on redesigning science curriculums, biology curriculums, to emphasize, in her case especially, the symbiotic view of cell evolution, which is a narrative that was known to biologists for a long time. She didn't originate it. She gathered a lot of evidence to support it, but there's much older work that it's based on. And she had a whole vision of how to redesign the biology curriculum in light of symbiosis as a driving factor in evolution that steers biology away from the competitive social Darwinist narrative grafted onto evolutionary theory. And so I think that's actually something that's extremely important. And there has been some work done in education theory and in education practice that's been inspired by the enactive approach. I don't have the names and the studies just immediately to hand, but there are definitely who have tried to take enactive ideas into educational contexts into science education and into education that rebalances, the procedural and the declarative to, to refer to the things that Richie was talking about. And then I would, just add, by way of finishing this comment, that I think what Richie just said about the importance of, let's call it skill, know-how, that conception of knowledge is so downplayed in this domain. I mean, we're familiar with it in certain domains, art and music and sports. It's obvious there, but we really haven't brought it to bear on the mind, on the transformation of mind, individually and interpersonally, and that is, I think, a hugely important factor that needs to have a lot of work done on it to move these things forward.
Thank you so much, Evan. And just let me draw everyone's attention to there is more conversation on this topic that's occurring in the chat box. So you may want to glance at some of that, particularly since we unfortunately don't have time to make explicit in our conversation all of those interesting comments. So we are getting close to our appointed time of adjournment, and I'm very conscious of the fact that if we run over time, we have to supply virtual coffee to all of our European colleagues. So are there other things that, particularly among the faculty and our discussants, are waiting to be said? Roshi, not seeing any immediately, I wonder if you would be willing to say a few words that round out what we've been talking about and that bring us to a grateful and appreciative close.
Thank you, Al, so much. And thank you, everybody. I'm really grateful for this day and actually these 2 days. It's, as I sit here as a practitioner, contemplative practice person, and as also a social activist, it's not possible for me to ignore what is happening in our country in relation to the massacre of children in Uvalde, Texas, to the war in Ukraine, to our forests in New Mexico, in massive conflagration. And one of the things that Ezekiel said, which I disagreed with, is that, but perhaps I didn't understand fully what he meant, but that the inactive perspective is a view that, from my own perspective, again, as a contemplative and as a social activist, is one that is really important for us to consider at this time in relation to what it is to be a moral being on the earth today and with other moral beings. And I think Hannah's work points to this. There's a deep sense of responsibility that is present for many of us in relation to how view affects the world around us and how the world around us is affecting our view, which is what I think moved so many of us about Abiba's presentation. And so I don't see the inactive perspective as being separate from our economies, our politics at all. But this is just my own view of the inactive view, that it implies that there is an ethic there that I think Hannah is pointing to in relation to mutuality, and that is contingent. And so this, perspective, which we will pursue, this thread at the level of what responsibilities we have as individuals to really make visible, our views, in such a way that we can respond to the world in a way that doesn't conduce to more suffering. So, in that relation, I think that what John brought up in terms of Dharmakirti, or one of the Mahayana perspectives, there are multiple Mahayana perspectives. And what Hannah points to also in terms of the value of not knowing, what is it to be able to actually deconstruct the views that are conducing to an extractive perspective and actions that are causing so much suffering. And what is it to have, an ephemeral view, which I think the enactive one is, which is emergent, which is constantly changing in response to the conditions that we're experiencing on a moment-to-moment basis. So of course, as a social activist and environmental activist, I'm always, looking at these functional connections. And not to say that, again, what you were implying, Ezekiel, that you can't, put the enactive view in the midst of politics, whereas I think it should be in the midst of politics and in the midst of our education. And I really want to thank Amy and Gabor and Mind and Life Europe with all my heart for jumping into this collaborative experiment of spanning the ocean and bringing our European friends with our good friends here in the United States together in the alchemy of the old Lindisfarne way, which is kind of like a consort, where we stir together, not necessarily come to, a monolithic conclusion. But thank you, beloved Amy and Gabor. I'm so happy about our collaboration. And to also say my heart is deeply open to the translators who had to, like greyhounds, run along aside each other and us. Taking a pretty complex content into the world of the French speaker and the Spanish speaker. I just thank you so much, Nirakara, and thank you so much, Geneviève, for taking the risk of doing this. And then behind the Upaya curtain, Joanne, Noah, and others, Natalie, there's this whole tiny machine here at the Zen Center that holds all of this that we do. And I just thank you. It is the most peaceful, generative, loving, efficient team, which is responsive, not operating by rules, but really trying to hear the cries of the world and those who are technologically less facile. So that we can be in this consort together. So thank you, dear friends. Thank you, Al, for stewarding and guiding, being a shepherd, and Amy for your brilliant reflection and for our beloved faculty. And may we find all of this very interesting experience of being in the embrace of this pandemic. May the embrace loosen so we can travel to each other's places and have warm hand to warm hand, except Evan, I know you'll never come back here, but we'll get you on the screen. Thank you all so very, very much. And as Noah suggested, your donations make all this possible. A way that we can support the faculty. And I want to mention Tom Driscoll, our good friend who provided the seed money for the liftoff of Varela. And you make it, you, Tom, and all of you who donated make this possible. So thank you so much.